Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, it's Thursday afternoon, and normally I come down to the Senate floor to talk about the Alaskan of the Week. I call that person. It's one of my favorite things to do in the Senate. But, Mr. President, I just witnessed something so remarkable, disturbing, that I actually wanted to come down to the Senate floor and explain what just happened on the floor. Because I think a lot of people probably missed it. If you're watching at home, maybe you didn't understand it. A lot of discussion going on here. But let me just say, the Senate Minority Leader from New York just objected to extending the current level of unemployment insurance in the CARES Act, $600 a week, to help American workers who have been laid off due to the pandemic. He just objected to that and stopped legislation that was moving on the floor to extend unemployment insurance for another week. So let me repeat that. The Senate Minority Leader, the U.S. Senate, when we are moving in good faith, as we're discussing and negotiating bills here, one element of CARES is going to expire at the end of this month. Unemployment insurance in the CARES Act, the Senate Minority Leader just blocked that from happening. Who knows why? But there'll be millions of Americans in 2 days who will lose that benefit, and the Senate Minority Leader just blocked it. I sure hope our friends in the media write this story, because that's exactly what happened. Let me describe in a little bit more detail, Mr. President. So, as you would expect in a democracy, in the United States Senate, we've been debating, working on, negotiating a new relief package due to the pandemic. We passed unanimously in this body the CARES Act in March to try to bring relief to our fellow Americans who we knew were going to be hurting from this pandemic. But we didn't have a crystal ball on how long relief could last or should last. Unemployment for businesses, small businesses, for families, for hospitals, for schools, for fishermen. So we are now working on, as you expect, in a democracy, what we view as the appropriate next level. Because this is extended longer than many of us thought, and the impacts are very significant. So that's what we're doing here. The Republicans put forward the Health, Economic Assistance, Liability Protection, and Schools Act, HEALS. Mr. President, I think it's a good bill. It's not a perfect bill, but it has very significant resources for schools, for hospitals, for families. And when I was home in Alaska and doing calls with my fellow Alaskans and heard what their priorities are and heard what they said was really important for them to have in any kind of next relief package, part of my job is to listen and try and work hard to get that done. And there's a lot. And the HEALS Act is exactly what my constituents have been pressing for, what they need, what I believe they need. Let me give you a couple examples, Mr. President. More flexibility for states and local governments on how to use the CARES Act funding that they already have. Very high priority. Additional funds for our fishermen. The presiding officer knows how important that is, being from Florida. But the original CARES Act had $300 million. That was a provision I got in the CARES Act. For fishermen, not enough, but something important to this really critical part of the Alaska and American and Florida economies. The HEALS Act has $500 million in it because they've been hit so hard. There's economic assistance in terms of another round of paycheck protection for small businesses whose revenues have been crushed, like in the tourism industry. Again, something my constituents have been asking about. Allowing 501c6s to access the PPP, that's in there. Allowing certain PPP borrowers like fishermen and seasonal businesses to request an increase in loan amounts due to changes that were in the interim final rules that came out of the Treasury Department. That's in there. Dramatic expansion of testing, more funding for vaccine development. Everybody wants that. Securing supply chains for crucial medical equipment and critical minerals, many of which we have in Alaska. That's all in there. Mr. President, it's a pretty good bill. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good bill. The competing bill, you may have seen, you may have read in the paper, a couple months ago came from the House, the so-called HEROES Act. It's a behemoth in terms of the price tag, and it has some things that actually are similar to the HEALS Act, school funding, hospitals. It has other things that aren't in the HEALS Act. Some things that I think would be completely unnecessary. A huge tax break for some of the richest Americans in the HEROES Act. Yes, that's in there. Economic impact payments for illegal immigrants. I don't think that's a priority right now, at least not for my constituents. An overt attack on Alaska Native organizations, dozens and dozens of them, and Alaska Native corporations, stripping them of any federal funds they received in the CARES Act. That's in the HEROES Act, the House-passed HEROES Act. Trust me, that'll never pass on the Senate floor because I won't allow it. But that's in there. Highly inappropriate attack on 20% of the population of my state. But, Mr. President, here's the point. These are starting points. This is what happens in the Senate. Or at least I thought so. These are starting points. But I guess I was wrong, because when my good friend from Arizona came down and said, we're having negotiations on these bills, we're having negotiations on how and to what degree to extend unemployment insurance from the federal government, she put forward a bill that we all agreed to that said, because we're negotiating right now, and the one thing in the CARES Act that expires at the end of this month is unemployment insurance, let's extend it. At the current level it is right now, let's extend it so the people who are relying on it can have something for the next week while we continue to negotiate and debate. That's very reasonable. That happens all the time here. And the Senate Minority Leader came down and he blocked it. He blocked it. If you're not going to be receiving a check next week, there's one person you can blame. And what did he say when he blocked it? Remarkably, he said, in essence, if the other side doesn't accept the entire HEROES Act, that bill that I just talked about that attacks Alaska Natives, then I'm going to block everything. Mr. President, that's what happened on the Senate floor like an hour ago. Now, that's not working in good faith. I'm sure that the minority leader believes that the national media won't blame him. He's probably right. But it should. But it should. If you're one of the millions of Americans who are worried about this issue because you're out of work, we just put forward a very simple compromise. As we continue to negotiate, we'll continue the unemployment levels paid to Americans that were in the CARES Act for another week at the levels that currently exist. And it was blocked by the Senate Minority Leader without a real explanation, essentially saying, take our Nancy Pelosi $4 trillion bill or nothing. I sure hope the media reports on what just happened. I don't have faith that they will, but that's exactly what happened. We're facing a national crisis. We don't always come together in immediate agreement on everything, but what we've seen in the last several months is that we have come together in the Congress. These bills haven't been perfect. The bills I just described, whether HEALS or HEROES, aren't perfect, but what they require is compromise and working together. And when you can't get to a spot in a certain amount of time, you look at areas where, oh, okay, this is going to expire right now. That's pretty important. Let's extend it for a week or two. That happens all the time here. And people do it in good faith. What we just saw was bad faith. What we just saw, in my view, was the Senate Minority Leader taking hostage this issue, hoping that his friends in the national media will somehow blame us. Well, I think if you're telling the truth and you just watch what happened on the Senate floor, that's going to be hard to do. So, Mr. President, my view is we got to come together in good faith to help our fellow Americans, my fellow Alaskans, many of whom are still really, really hurting. And we had a senator from Arizona who tried to do that just an hour ago on the floor, and it was rejected. And there's going to be a lot of people next week who are going to be hurting because of this. And I hope they accurately report why they're hurting, what just happened. And that's not the spirit of compromise that we're going to need to get through this pandemic. I yield the floor.